Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Maritime Sports Support Unit podcast on accessibility and systemic ableism. I am going to be hosting this program, and I'll be joined by Kent Cadogan Loftsgard. Sorry, Kent. And we'll be talking about systemic ableism and accessibility in Canada. And we'll be trying to link our thoughts to the work of MSSU to see where we can be able to find some improvements or think through the work of MSSU differently. So my name is Prince Owusu. I am an EDIA equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility trainee at the MSSU. And I'm also a PhD candidate at the School of Social Work at Carleton University. So before I tell you a bit more about Kent, I'll first like to acknowledge that we are joining this podcast on Turtle Island. I invite each of you listening to this podcast to reflect on where you are on the land and your relationship to it, as well as indigenous descendant of settlers, or as a more recent settler, or even as an immigrant. A reminder that our unresolved history is our present responsibility, and to hold space for the tensions that may arise as we try to unravel that. Politically, we also stand for indigenous self-determination and also believe in engaging in reconciliation with all indigenous peoples as we chart the path forward. So our aim is to hold this podcast for about an hour, and as we discuss the topic for the day, which is systemic ableism and accessibility. This particular area of focus was brought together by the EDIA working group under MSSU because of its pertinence. And I talk about the pertinence of this area because usually in discussions around equity, diversity, and inclusion, accessibility gets lost. And so we are deliberate about centering it in our podcast today. And Kent would help us try to think through that as well as a focal or as an important aspect of inclusion and diversity, and any approach towards equity, we need to center accessibility. So I'll hand it over to Kent to tell us a bit more about himself, and then we will proceed with our questions and responses, and just thinking through in a conversation style what accessibility and systemic ableism is all about. Kent.
Thanks so much, Prince. And just in keeping with your land acknowledgement that you mentioned in your introduction, it's pertinent for me to note that I'm joining you from the Lower Lonsdale neighborhood of North Vancouver in British Columbia on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples.
Thanks, Kent. So we'll begin today with our first sort of question that I would like to think through. So Kent, I'm going to ask you to share your thoughts first off on systemic ableism and accessibility. What does it mean to you in your personal journey? What encounters have you had, and that will be able to flesh this out for listeners?
Well, I would say that my personal experience of anything that might fall under the systemic ableism designation has tended to be uh, mm, at one of two extremes on the scale, because as a person who has lived experience of congenital cerebral palsy and a long history of pediatric asthma, but also brings a fairly diverse professional set of perspectives to the health and science table, as someone originally trained in trauma-based paramedicine, various different kinds of research methodologies, health specialty communications, clinical education, team-based care that I've been teaching at UBC for the past 11 years, and I've become an evangelist of various kinds of team-based care and interdisciplinary comprehension. Um, and entering into what I affectionately refer to as the CIHR universe, that for me, that introduction started through the founding of the BC Support Unit, which is very similar in mission, I'm sure, to the Maritime Support Unit. And over the last several years, since the fall of 2016, when we first opened the BC Support Unit, we have expanded by leaps and bounds by way of amalgamation of various different organizations, the Academic Health Science Network and the Michael Smith BC Health Research Foundation. And that has led, in my case, to a bunch of different invitations and opportunities to participate across the CIHR landscape, including the Committee for Accessibility and Systemic Ableism, which was how I was introduced to to you and to the Maritime Support Unit, and how we were led to this particular interview. And in my professional life, I have found that people tend to respond to me with one of two extremes. At the more positive end of that, it's, well, yes, you can, and of course you do, and they don't find it strange at all that there are such things as health and science professionals who are also people with chronic conditions and disabilities, and they look at that as a benefit, and almost as like a cross-translational tool that I can use to sometimes help the occasionally warring factions to get along a little better by reminding them that patient benefit is the point of all healthcare, and the point of all health research is to inform best practices patient care, is a way that I commonly like to put it. But on the other end of the scale, there has been some adjustment, I'll call it, to the idea that people who have lived patient experience can also be relevant kinds of professionals. And that has gotten to be a little bit more confusing and potentially muddy for some people as the era of patient engagement has evolved, because it can still happen commonly that when we're talking about patient engagement in many different kinds of circles, the patient perspective is still frequently presumed to be a health and science layperson's perspective. And so when when you are a person like me who has lived experience as a patient, particularly as somebody who has never been any other way than I am now because I was born with my condition. And then on top of that, through various both conventional and some unconventional ways, I have been able to become, a health and science and clinical education professional of various kinds. And there are still some people who have difficulty realizing that such people exist. So I would say that, it's been both a positive and a negative to me. And so my experience of systemic ableism, has not been consistent, but I have definitely noticed that it is a thing that can happen.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that perspective, Kent. With your professional experience and with your knowledge base also, it becomes I believe with the assumptions that people come with, I think they get a lot of confusion around that because they assume that some level of luck, but then at the same time, when you are called into those spaces that you have extreme knowledge, then there's also a bit of confusion. So thanks for bringing that perspective to bear. So in those moments where you have found that people do not really sort of understand you, in those muddy moments, how do you unravel that? How do you develop workarounds for people who are sort of confused about your role and the level of knowledge and the importance, say for instance, your contribution, that the important contributions that you bring, for those that get confused about inviting you into spaces of power and of in spaces where you make actual contributions. How do you work around that as you have talked about?
An interesting thing has begun to happen now over the past several years. I have increasingly found that I have never yet been disqualified from a professional space by my patient status once they understand the full scope of my potential contributions. But if I am ever invited into a space that is meant as a patient engagement space, it has happened several times now that I have been disqualified from patient engagement spaces by my professional perspectives. So, that by itself is a kind of, I don't know, would that qualify as like a reverse
Yes,
ableism
yes.
of a of a kind, because it does seem very strange that because there is this presumption often that the patient's perspective is meant to be a health and science layperson's perspective, I have continued to find increasingly that once you bring, you know, particularly a variety of professional perspectives to the table, no matter what your patient perspectives may also be, congenital, acquired, and otherwise, it can be increasingly possible, as I have found, that maybe you don't really count as a patient anymore in a patient engagement qualification sense.
Mm, mm, mm. Thanks for bringing that that perspective on, because it's really rare that people would have that sort of point of view, because usually I think as part of ableism also, we tend to think in a linear fashion that it has to be from a person who is lay, who has no understanding, and who is basically struggling with the system. Now, when the reverse is on, with lots of competency, with lots of understanding, perhaps even more than those that you're engaging with, then the tension emerges. So thanks for bringing that to bear. Perhaps what I want us to also think through is engaging with the healthcare system itself. Have you had any experiences engaging with the healthcare system itself that has been particularly challenging for you in your own journey that you could share?
I consider myself lucky in my engagements with the healthcare system, because many of those were during my pediatric years, where I received excellent care from our local BC Children's Hospital here. And the way that I like to describe those formative years being served by BC Children's Hospital is that I learned more by demonstration than by declaration. about the positive principles of patient-centered care that I've been extolling in various circles, ever since. And really, those early childhood experiences were what inspired me to put healthcare at the center of my professional life. And I really learned that interpersonal skill is the first thing that we have in our relational toolkit to help patients feel better, even before we know everything that we hope to find out about what we can do to help them get better.
So from your point of view, those interpersonal skills were what you learned early on. So that has sort of guided your own journey. Would I be right if I said that?
Very much so, very much so. In addition to that, I have often talked about how I have had the embarrassingly consistent experience of primary care, because here in the Vancouver area, I have been fortunate to have the same primary care clinic my entire life since I was small enough for my mom to carry me inside. And I've had good relationships with the doctors that I've had, over the years at that clinic, starting from the time when I was just small, young pediatric age, up until now. But from the time that I was early double-digit age, I had to go to the doctor to have them, at least sign various forms and things, as we do for, different kinds of medical procedures or permission slips for this or that, and they would always say, well, I don't know what to write. And from a very early age, I always knew what to write, or at least had some idea of how to get started. So when I was still very young, like early into my double-digit age years, I started filling out the forms myself, and I used to get my mom to do the writing for me so that it would look more adult. and then I would just take the forms to the doctor and review what I had written, and they could obviously see that everything was logical, and they know that I'm not a nut, and they were perfectly happy to sign off on everything. And that's essentially the same procedure that I have followed when necessary today, because it saves my primary care doctors a whole lot of time filling out forms that they shouldn't have to fill out. But we have things where a doctor's signature is necessary, because that's just the sort of the structure of our healthcare society for certain things. So I think that I've been able to save them some time and occasionally teach them a thing or two about maybe some idea of what to write for other people in similar circumstances who might not have the knowledge or experience that I have about how to do that.
That's excellent. Actually, it segues neatly into ideas around self-advocacy that's gaining currency these days. And I like to pick your mind on how perhaps the Canadian healthcare system, or Canada as a whole, can create opportunities for self-advocacy for those that identify with diverse lived experiences when it comes to ability or disability, and how we can actually go about achieving that, because usually those voices get silenced because, as maybe perhaps in your case, it looks a bit different. But if you think up through the aggregate levels, how can we create those opportunities for self-advocacy for those that identify with various forms of disability?
Right. And I think in response to your question, I'm going to go into an area where maybe others that you might have talked to on this topic, have not gone, but because particularly when not just in Canada, but in North America generally, and most of the world, we have an increasingly severe demand versus supply problem when it comes to primary care. Now, there are certain things that I believe we could do to remove barriers to foreign trained health professionals to be able to practice in Canada. But I also think that there are ways that we have mostly not really explored to have more people with different kinds of disabilities and chronic conditions practicing in parts of healthcare by removing or at least reducing some of what's called the technical standards barriers that are currently the case in many medical schools, because right now technical standards in many cases they require a certain degree of physical capacity to be able to qualify to enroll in medical school. But my contention for the last many years since I wrote an article on this topic with a colleague of mine that is somebody that I have mentored over the years when we worked for a magazine called New Mobility. We wrote an article on the perspective of the American market for looking at the two different scenarios between if you are a person with a chronic mobility disability and you're trying to get into medical school, how difficult is that compared to being a person already in an existing degree of clinical practice who gets something like a spinal cord injury, for example? Like, how easy is it to stay in practice? And that was back in about 09 that we wrote that article, and at some point it's a topic that I might like to revisit to some degree to see if things in the US have changed. But it certainly has gotten me thinking about what we can do in Canada, particularly to remove technical standards barriers so that potentially we could have people with varying degrees of disability who might not be able to do all of the physical procedures necessary for our common understanding of a primary care doctor, but who might be really good analysts and diagnosticians. So that then we could have a separate clinical role that would be for those physical procedures, and people that have different kinds of physical limitations but really good brains could stick to the diagnostics and analytics. In the States, there is another clinical role that we haven't had so much in practice in Canada called physician's assistants. And I know that increasingly in Canada, thankfully, we have an aspect of primary care that's become more popular called nurse practitioners, which they also have in the States. And the way that I have described to my students the difference between nurse practitioners and physician's assistants is to say that a nurse practitioner is like registered nurse plus, but a physician's assistant is like doctor minus. So I think that if a time were to come, particularly when we could more confidently and comfortably introduce the role of physician's assistants into Canada, at least my imagination is that might allow more opportunities potentially for people with physical limitations who would still make really good, diagnosticians and analysts, to be able to practice in various ways in Canada, even if they don't have the physical capacity to do things like stitching, say, for example.
Yeah, that sounds great. That's such a great perspective, and would actually really help the system as a whole if people who have those forms of perhaps disability are still called to work in those spaces. Then I believe that layer of navigating healthcare with people who do not necessarily identify with uh, disability itself will be broken, that kind of barrier, because we see that not only with disability, but even with those that have different forms of barriers, including language. And also even thinking through meaningful engagement with persons with disability, and also thinking about the work of MSSU, specifically an organization that is devoted to sort of bringing together the maritime region to do patient-oriented research. I'm wondering your thoughts on how we can begin to see more meaningful patient engagement right throughout research, from the start or the conception of the idea to actually go and research or the topic to its execution or delivery. How can we as an organization, or the MSSU as an organization or a group, involve patients in its processes so that they would have a voice, not just be tokenistic or be add-ons, but they would have voice throughout the research process. What do you think we can do to ensure that kind of meaningful patient engagement?
I think that kind of best practices process is something that is continuing to evolve in the right direction. At the BC Support Unit and various other places in Canada, we have increasingly begun to think about the idea of not just patient identified research priorities, but actual patient-led research, where traditionally, instead of having a researcher that was reaching out to engage with patients, either because they recognized the real value of that, or because they were having to figure out how to do it because it's increasingly becoming a requirement of funding. but also, I mean, the idea of patient-led research is that patients are the catalysts that then would be reaching into the research community to find others to partner with to bring their own ideas to fruition.
Yeah, I think we are still heading towards that, and it's still a long ways to go, but that prioritizing that area as a requirement for funding, I believe that's a good service, but sometimes can be to the disadvantage as well, because then what could happen potentially is that those that are extremely marginalized would not be heard, and those that are uh, in those spaces, or those that are able to take advantage of those opportunities, are those that will be called on increasingly in multiple researches. So I think that tension is also something that we have to work through when we are involving patient partners in research, to make sure that the processes are equitable, and that we do not keep using the same categories of people, so that the as even in any form of oppression, including disability, there are diverse areas for consideration. And when we think through intersectionality, we can appreciate that there are people who face multiple axes of oppression. So we always have to keep sort of enlarging our pool of patient partners so that we can be able to get at the crux of the issues across board.
For sure we do. And I think part of how we do that in a best practices kind of way is to perpetually keep asking ourselves, who's not at the table? Who haven't we heard from? Who isn't represented? Because at the same time as there is this frequent presupposition that the patient partner's perspective is always supposed to be a health and science layperson's perspective, the reality is that the more that we engage with people who might have started out from a legitimately layperson's health and science perspective, the more that those people are engaged, and the more that we diversify their capabilities and capacities, the more that those will continue to, resemble those of the professionals. And so by perpetually asking ourselves, who haven't we heard from, who's not represented, we're hopefully reaching out to connect with some of the people who don't have as much of an innate ability to reach in and and connect with us. Because at the same time as I think that obviously when you have a specific condition under study, it's very important for the voices of people with those specific conditions to absolutely be heard. Another area where I have experienced some pushback in the past is in the way that I am a person who cares a lot about conditions and diagnoses that I myself don't have. And in a patient engagement space, sometimes people will regard that as strange because the large majority of engaged patients, I find, are doing one of two things, or maybe two of two things to varying degrees, in the sense that A, they're either looking to advance the care and treatment of their own condition, or they're looking for various forms to rail against parts of the health and science system for some way that they feel that it has wronged them. I don't I don't tend to do any of that. I think that health and science only works when we're allowed to care about conditions that we don't have, because imagine how ridiculous it would be if the only clinicians and scientists that you could ever visit were people who had personally experienced whatever condition you're going to them to have treated or addressed. That wouldn't work as as a model for health or science. So I think that even for those of us that are professionals of various kinds moving in the health and science system, we need to be allowed to care about conditions that we don't have as well.
Yeah, definitely so. I think much of that would also have to do with some assumptions that we have, that the only person that's competent enough to speak about specific conditions are those that have those conditions, right? So immediately we see someone with a different condition, or who identifies as having a different condition, speaking up on behalf of that group, then we become a bit uncomfortable and it becomes strange. So I think that assumption
Right.
is something that we need to trouble also moving forward.
Right. And I don't know, I expect that this was probably somewhere on your list of questions, but just thinking about some of the aspects of intersectionality of, multiple points of diversity or potential marginalization. Like you, I am also a person of, I'm a Black person of color. And Barbadian on one side and Norwegian on the other, if that's even something that is possible for people to imagine as a thing that can happen. But in my own experience, I have lived what I would consider to be almost a completely free life, absent of racism, at least that I was aware of, because in the large majority of circumstances, when you want something to discriminate against me about, It's much easier and potentially more socially acceptable to just go to the disability by default. So really the only experiences of racism that I know of that I have experienced in my life have come from other people with disabilities.
Mm,
And the reason why I mentioned this is because, in uh, all of this kind of integrated work that we're trying to do across the health and science system, looking at diversity, points of inclusion, this kind of stuff, there has been a lot of focus on integrating indigenous perspectives. But I think a big mistake that we have made there is to presume that any indigenous perspective is every indigenous perspective. In
mm,
other words, what I mean is, you have one indigenous person at the table and you expect that person to represent every possible nuance of indigenous perspective. And anyone who looks closely at the world events of the past few years will know that it's very possible to have debate and dissension among indigenous perspectives. So,
yeah,
so I think that is also something that we have to think carefully about when we're talking about the broader spectrum of EDI considerations.
yeah. That's a very interesting thought, and it's really happening across board, and it also perhaps speaks to historic oppression of indigenous peoples, and where we are at in terms of reconciliation, and where we are at in terms of including and indigenous perspectives, and also perhaps granting opportunities for self-determination. It's usually a tokenistic approach. So when it gets the when an individual gets into those spaces, we always would call on them for everything. So they also feel, on another hand, a burden to perform, and also to speak up about diverse issues, even in areas that perhaps are not their forte, or where they are not necessarily competent, because most often, as we would find, they are the only people identifying as indigenous, or persons included who the only person included who identified as being indigenous. So it speaks to also to a broader systemic issues around racism and denial of opportunities for indigenous peoples. But that's a very, very great thought that you brought, that it's important to recognize that there's the multiplicity of perspectives, and there's nothing like an indigenous people's perspective that's unitary, or that's single. It's a lot of different people and communities. So we need to always reflect on that and be cognizant of that. And speaking about intersectionality, also, it's good to always take a moment to recognize who we also are, and the limitations that our own worldviews and our own experiences bring. Because usually when it comes to issues about accessibility and systemic ableism, we all have different or multiple levels of encounters when it comes to oppression. There are people who would identify perhaps as disabled or with a particular chronic condition, but would also identify as perhaps gender diverse, and that itself will present many other layers of oppression that they have to encounter or work through within the healthcare system. People who would identify as you and I do, as Black, and that alone changes everything for them. And it's interesting that you talk also about some of the tensions within the community as well. And it's important to highlight that, so that we recognize that we, even within different communities, there are tensions, and we all always need to strive towards sort of building community together, and it's never an easy process towards getting to those objectives. As we fight without or outside, we fight also within to save space. So that's a very nuanced thought that you bring there. I'm wondering.
Sorry, go ahead. Go
Okay,
ahead.
go ahead, Kent. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I was just going to add that one of the things that I wish, if I had a magic wand of relational peace and harmony to wave, is that I wish that particularly within the health and science and research space, that we had what feels like a bit of a safer space for people with invisible conditions to be comfortable disclosing them. And this is something that I personally haven't had to deal with in my own life, because the nature of my condition is such that disclosure is made, for me, whether I want it to be or not. And so I'm either going to be accepted or I won't. But several of the people that have been contributors to CIHR's efforts on accessibility and systemic ableism are people with invisible conditions of various kinds, who have talked at length at not really feeling, the large majority of the time, like they exist in a safe space where disclosure is not something that is going to predispose them to some sort of discrimination. Now, I would like to believe that everyone with an invisible condition has the kind of self-assurance that it takes to be able to disclose out of a kind of solidarity to those of us for whom disclosure is not optional. But I have learned that unfortunately that's not the case, and that in many cases there is still a kind of protectionistic behavior that keeps people from disclosing out of a fear of being discriminated against. And I think that we need to think conscientiously about how we're reacting to people with invisible conditions. And I think that we need to be more intentional about inviting them into the safety of disclosure.
Yes, that's excellent. I think a lot of people are silenced because of the challenge of feeling accepted even when they speak out, or when or being minimized, or being dismissed. I think lots of people have had, especially with invisible disabilities, have had issues with their, not just with lay people or people who perhaps they encounter, but also even within the healthcare system. Some of them have had pushbacks against their conditions and what they identify as. Sometimes they have
Right.
challenges within the healthcare system, doctors failing to sign on different diagnoses in order to access disability support and all. So they come out with that kind of awareness that there is always going to be a challenge speaking up. So those processes, I think, somehow silence their voices also.
And in my efforts to teach parts of best clinical practice, I think one of the things that is also relevant for parts of the research sciences system is, I have attempted to um, help various different kinds of clinicians that I have contributed to their training to understand that diagnostically, we should not get in the habit of blaming the cause of everything that you can't see on everything that you can see. in this in the sense that people that have pre-existing visible conditions obviously also there's a very high probability that they will have some degree of acquired or congenital invisible conditions as well. But your diagnostic procedure shouldn't just assume that, every condition that I might have that you can't see is caused by my cerebral palsy that you can see, is the point that I'm making there. And that has been, a bit of a challenge for some, a bit of a challenge for some people, I think, because occasionally we have clinicians that are looking for the easy out, but every time I've been in a room of clinicians where I say, diagnostically, don't blame the cause of everything you can't see on everything that you can see, they sort of go, oh, right, I should have thought of that, yeah, kind of thing. So I think it's at its simplest, it's just one of those things that occasionally, clinically, we need to be reminded of that kind of best practice.
Yeah, really. So I'd like us to move on to one of the focal areas or the core strategic areas of MSSU, which is a health system learning. And with health system learning, it's almost to think of it as a loop from patient engagement back into research and back from research into new innovative ways of perhaps engaging patients, and then back to patient engagement. So with this, I mean, I'm trying to get at how can we ensure that we are learning from patients in ways that would inform, as you have talked about, best practices or promising practices in healthcare. How do we create those opportunities to be able to learn from those that have first voice or those that have lived experiences with disabilities? Because usually we hear when we engage with the disability community that they are not feeling as heard. So I'm wondering how we can create those opportunities to be able to learn from them in ways that will not just be part of the data, but will be data that will be transformational, that will bring to bear changes within the system. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I have become something of an evangelist when it comes to the learning health system, which, to my surprise, uh, I think it remains a bit esoteric to people that you would expect to have a clearer understanding of it. To me, the basic parameters of the learning health system are pretty easy to understand. And the way that I have described it is basically, as a cyclical methodology by which every aspect of the health and science system informs the evolution and advancement of every other aspect of the health and science system. And one way that we can do that integrates and continues to remember to integrate patients and patient benefit into that cycle, I think, is absolutely by evaluating our outcomes, of different kinds of, activities, projects, etc. And also being sure that we're closing the loop with entire research teams, because one of the things that I have continued to say many times over the past several years of being involved with different levels of CIHR, provincially, nationally, and to some degree internationally, is that we just have to remember that the learning curve can bend. The way that I put it is the learning curve can bend equally across all of the stakeholders. It's not like you bring together an interdisciplinary research team and everybody else knows exactly what they're supposed to be doing, and then we have the patients who don't know anything at all. Because it can happen just as much that if you're bringing in a clinical or research perspective, that there's just as much potential for that person to be like, I know who I am and I know what I do, but who are you and why are you here? What do you do? It's the same sort of thing, no matter what your role is. So I think that we need to get away again from that common thing of presuming that it's only the patients that don't know anything about who they are or what they're supposed to do there, uh, because that happens in every other role as well.
Yeah. That's so true. That's so true. So also, one thing I've been thinking about is thinking through access itself, and how even joining this particular podcast, we had different challenges with access. So I'm thinking about the use of technology and how sometimes, because we have different ableist assumptions, we tend to neglect to think through how some platforms, for instance, can lack can bring about a lack of access. This is particularly important because I've been hearing recently that there are different healthcare systems that are thinking about going online, for instance, but have not really dealt with the challenges that it might present for persons with disability and even persons who do not necessarily have access. Because when we think about disability and we are thinking through intersectionality, we can think about poverty, for instance, and the role that it plays, class and the role that it plays, and all these can sometimes have implications for who has access and which types of access. For maybe it might be a bit far removed from your experience, but for some people, navigating the any online system is a challenge, and I think sometimes they get lost in ideas around healthcare promotion that's now increasingly going online, especially within this era where we still are dealing with a pandemic, for instance. So I wonder if you have any thoughts around how particularly challenging the use of technology can be for persons with disability or people from the disability community.
Yeah, I think that the pandemic actually helped us to, as a broader audience, to realize the potential of virtual care as an actual modality of outreach for various kinds of primary care. Because in the disability community, we had been asking for various kinds of digital health tools and virtual care methods for years. And often many of us were just sort of put off as, oh, well, no, it's not practical. We can't really do that. The in-office visit is what's supported by the billing codes and sort of the payment infrastructure that we have for primary caregivers. But as soon as the pandemic hit, hit us all, and the entire world became a kind of public health patient. That I think was what gave us the critical mass of influence necessary to make the change. And then all of a sudden, everybody was like, "Oh, virtual care, wonderful!" But the problem that happens with that is that what if you're a person who lives in a rural and remote community that maybe doesn't even have consistent access to the internet? What if you're a person of a certain age or a demographic that has never really been exposed to technology enough to learn about it and integrate it as part of your everyday life? I think that there are still those challenging questions that we need to ask ourselves. And thankfully, we have technology innovators, like Elon Musk, that are doing that's doing what he can to help, internet through satellite to be able to reach into more rural and remote areas where maybe we don't need quite so much on the ground infrastructure for internet to be able to reach those people. So that much is good. But then, we have to think about the complications of cost and access to things like computers and smartphones and things like that, that even once you get internet access into those rural and remote areas, then how do you get the various kinds of technological conveyances that people need in order to be able to take full advantage of everything that would otherwise be available to them?
Yeah, that's an excellent thought. Usually when we think through access, one limitation that always presents itself is the rural-urban divide. And usually things that we might take for granted in urban areas becomes usually a challenge. We have been recently talking to people in rural areas, and sometimes just some easy forms of technology that we find really possible and usable within urban areas becomes like a whole different dynamic when it's in the rural setting. Also, when you even think about policies around access and physical access to physical spaces, there is always the tension with historical sites, for instance, in some rural areas, and how to work around that. We have ideas, and very good progress has been made in urban areas, but sort of the investment and the cost, as you mentioned, into rural areas usually is not there, and so most rural areas that are sort of sometimes a few years behind the progress of urban areas, and that's sometimes very, very concerning when it comes to accessibility as well.
Well,
So,
and sorry, I was just going to say it's something that is particularly on my mind right now as we're recording this podcast. This podcast is produced by the Maritime Support Unit, and parts of the Maritimes are literally battening down the hatches as we speak, preparing for the onset of a potentially record-settingly severe
yeah,
storm. So then then what does that do to your access to technology, and what do we have to think about in advance in terms of a public health response? Because disaster response is public health response, and people with disabilities and chronic conditions are, I would say, a special considerations group when it comes to disaster response. So I would hope that more people than not, anyway, who might have any kind of disability or chronic condition, who are in the path of this storm that has been reported in the news, have thought carefully about how to reinforce their support network and to do what they need to do to be safe,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
both in the sense of being provided for in terms of what do they need to get through the onset of the storm and the storm period, but also in the event that they might need to evacuate,
Yeah.
how does that work, and how will they ensure that they can have their needs met. And as much as we love first responders, and as much as because first response of a kind was one of the first things that I was trained in while I was still a teenager, I think that our first response system sometimes fails to consider the needs of elderly people, of people with disabilities and chronic conditions, in terms of understanding that some people are not just going to be able to get up and move out if a storm comes
Mhm.
barreling down on their particular place of residence. And you know this particular podcast discussion will not be produced in time for this particular commentary to be of any use in the response that is happening right now to varying degrees. But I think it's important for people to keep thinking about that, because I think that as much as the support units are about research and research support, but it's also the same. It's also true that research, like I said earlier, is meant to inform best practices, patient care, and public health and emergency response are a part of patient care.
Yes, definitely so. And thanks for bringing this up as Hurricane Fiona threatens the maritime region. And it's true, I am connected to one of the universities at Nova Scotia, and there has been an alert that the university system might be shut down because of the the Hurricane Fiona threatening
Mhm.
uh, some form of the stability, this stability. But
Right.
we do not really know to what extent. So just out of solidarity, as you mentioned, this podcast might be available when it's past, and so it's not having any direct impact. But we just want to hold space and to reflect and to just share our thoughts that we are with them in our thoughts, the whole region, and especially for persons with disability whose evacuation and movement might be a challenge, and
Right.
just to reflect on the different challenges that this might present for them as well,
Right.
including even
And
the loss of life.
exactly. And in a learning health system type of way, I'm sure that there will be, public health and emergency response lessons to be gained from what happens in response to this storm, and to some degree, parts of what doesn't happen in response to this storm, because, in every circumstance, there are always things that could be done better. So hopefully we'll be able to take those lessons and help us to know better what to do next time.
Yes, 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 definitely so. So our thoughts are with you. If you get the chance to hear this afterwards, people in the maritime region.
Absolutely.
And just if I'm wondering if you have any concluding thoughts before we wrap up our podcast today. It's been great reflecting on systemic ableism and accessibility and the different assumptions that sort of that are brought to bear. You brought a very, very interesting perspective that usually is lost, and your voice really fleshes out different, a very, very unique and different perspective as well. When you talked about self-advocacy and how it's been part of you, when you talked about interpersonal relationships and how you have leveraged that as you have in your own journey. And also when you talked about being sort of an expert in areas where they might have assumed that a layperson's point of view held credence, and so how to sort of navigate that when you are an expert and you have lived experiences when it comes to disability. You brought to bear those perspectives very excellently, and I think it will be one of the highlights of this very podcast. I'm wondering if you have any concluding thoughts as we wrap up this podcast session.
Well, I'm glad that it has been an enjoyable discussion. I hope that it will be, useful as an archived asset for people that will hear this interview in the future. And, however rare my blend of perspectives might be, I'm glad that I've had this opportunity to share them with you, especially because, as you know, we've had to overcome, a certain amount of time zone and technological challenges to be able to connect for this conversation. So I'm glad that we were finally able to do that successfully, and I hope that this will be just another um, capacity building asset, if you will, for future teaching and learning as well.
Yes, definitely will be. Definitely will be. Such great perspectives and thoughts, and it's been great having you on. And I know part of the challenge was because of how successful it would be. So I'm glad that we could do this. Thank you so much, Kent.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and thank you.